For 100 years, the Northern Lords offered their daughters to the shadows. They sent their most radiant heirs to the Black Keep, hoping to break the curse of the slumbering Wolf King. Not one returned. Blood dried on the obsidian altar until hope rotted away. It became a cynical tax, a debt of flesh paid in human lives. Then came the frost of 1244. It was an unforgiving winter, burying the Ironwood pack under 6 feet of snow and a suffocating, silent terror. The centennial tribute was due. In the great hall of the Ironwood estate, Alpha Gideon Vane paced before the hearth. His heavy fur cloak dragged against the cold stone. Ancient law was absolute. The Alpha of the strongest pack had to deliver a royal maiden to the Ethelgard keep. This was the blood tithe. It was a ritual meant to appease King Alaric of House Valerius, the Lycan monarch trapped in a cursed sleep for exactly 1 century. The maesters claimed only the blood and breath of a royal wolf could wake him. But after 100 years of executions, the ritual was no longer a hope. It was a death sentence. Gideon's daughter, Cecilia, wept in the shadows. She clutched her silk skirts, her voice trembling. She told her father the keep was a graveyard. She called the cursed king a monster who drank the blood of his victims in his sleep. She begged not to go. Gideon Vane did not look at her. His eyes darted toward the heavy oak doors. He would not sacrifice his own. He turned to his lead huntsman, the scarred brute named Kalin. He ordered him to bring the Omega up from the kitchens, the Packless one. In the stained underbelly of the keep, Odette was scrubbing iron cauldrons. Her hands were cracked. They bled from the lye. Odette was an anomaly. In a world where wolves shifted under the moon, she was empty. She was a null. She had no wolf spirit. She had no family. 20 years ago, she was found wandering the borders as a toddler. She had nothing but a strange crescent scar on her collarbone. The pack took her in to serve as a slave. She was the lowest tier of existence. Kalen's heavy boots echoed on the cobblestones. Odette did not look up until his massive hand gripped her hair. He yanked her backward. He smelled of stale ale and tobacco. He told her the Alpha required her service. For a packless null, there was nowhere to run. She was dragged into the grand hall. Odette fell to her knees before the fire. The heat stung her frozen feet. She kept her eyes on the floor. It was a survival tactic learned over 2 decades of abuse. Cecilia sneered at her from the shadows. She complained that the girl smelled of old grease and dirt. She feared the magic of the Black Keep would reject a slave. She warned that the maesters would know they cheated the tribute. Gideon stepped down to tower over the girl. He spoke smoothly. The masters only required a maiden with the scent of the Ironwood pack. Odette had lived under his roof for 20 years. She smelled of their pines and their fires. They would dress her in Cecilia's old silk. They would drape her in the Ironwood crest. They thought they were throwing away trash. They did not know they were handing the true king his crown. The iron gates of Ethelgard do not care for lineage. Once those locks turn, the blood of a queen and the blood of a runt taste exactly the same. The tribute would be paid. The curse demanded its meat, and Gideon Vane had finally found a carcass to offer. Odette felt her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. Every child in the Ironwood pack grew up shivering to the same nursery rhyme. King Alaric waits in a bed of stone for a bride to chew to the very bone. "You are sending me to my execution," Odette said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. It was a cold, raspy alto that sliced through the crackling of the hearth fire. She finally raised her gaze. Her violet eyes, a shade so unnatural it made the pack's skin crawl, locked onto Gideon's. ___, Quote underscore one underscore underscore. Gideon didn't argue with words. He argued with bone. The Alpha struck her across the face with the back of his hand. The force sent Odette sprawling into the dirt, a fresh cut opening over her cheekbone. "You will do as you are told, Omega," Gideon roared. "You owe this pack your pathetic life. Now, you pay the debt. Dress her. The carriage leaves at midnight." They stripped away her rags and forced her into a heavy gown of midnight blue velvet. The fabric was stiff and reeked of mothballs and ancient dust. They pinned the silver direwolf of ironwood at her throat, a mockery of a status she never held. Through the entire ordeal, Odette remained silent. There was no point in screaming. In the Lycan territories, a packless wolf has fewer rights than a kennel hound. At the stroke of 12, Kaelin shoved her into a reinforced iron carriage. There was no honor guard, no grand procession, just a scarred huntsman, a weary driver, and a terrified scapegoat heading into the Deadlands. As the wheels lurched forward, leaving the only hell she had ever known, Odette wiped the dried blood from her cheek. She was going to die in a frozen, cursed tomb. But as she watched the Ironwood estate vanish into the blizzard, a dark thought comforted her. At least she would die far away from them. The journey north took 3 grueling weeks. The landscape shifted from the dense pines of Ironwood into a desolate wasteland known as the Wasting Moor. Here, the magic of the curse was a physical weight in the air. The trees were petrified. Their black branches looked like agonizing fingers reaching for a sunless gray sky. On the 21st day, the black keep of Ethelgard loomed through the fog. It was a colossal fortress carved directly into the side of a mountain. Its spires pierced the low clouds like obsidian needles. It did not look like a palace. It looked like a grave. Kaelin halted the carriage at the edge of the drawbridge. Odette's breath caught as the massive iron doors slowly groaned open. The bridge lowered on rusted chains, spanning a chasm that dropped into infinite blackness. "This is as far as I go," Kaelin grunted. The hardened huntsman was trembling. His inner wolf was whimpering beneath his skin, terrified of the ancient apex predator sleeping within those walls. "Get out!" Odette stepped out into the biting wind. The velvet dress offered no protection against the supernatural chill of the moor. "Walk across the bridge," Kaelin ordered. His hand stayed white-knuckled on his silver-hilted dagger. "Do not turn back. If you try to run, I will put an arrow through your spine." Odette didn't look at him. She gathered the heavy skirts of her gown and began to walk. The wooden planks groaned under her boots. Below her, the chasm whispered with the wind. It sounded eerily like a chorus of crying voices. Odette expected the massive iron doors of the keep to be locked. Instead, the freezing metal hummed beneath her palm. A decade of silence ended with the deafening screech of ancient hinges. The doors swung wide. Behind her, Kaelin whipped the horses into a frenzy. The carriage fled toward the south as if chased by demons. Odette stood alone. The grand foyer of Ethelgard was a cavern of perpetual frost. Black marble pillars held up a ceiling lost in shadow. But the hall was not empty. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Odette gasped. Dozens of statues were scattered across the floor. She stepped closer to one. Her breath hitched. A young woman stood in a decaying dress of emerald silk. Her face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Odette recognized the crest on the tarnished necklace. The River Run pack. This was no statue. This was Lady Beatrice, the tribute from 30 years ago. Odette backed away, only to collide with another frozen figure. A man in ceremonial armor from the Westfold pack. The curse had not killed these people. It had frozen them in time. They were living monuments of ice, forced to guard a slumbering king. The magical power required for this was unfathomable. They failed. A voice whispered through the hollow wind of the corridor. Odette wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering. She needed fire to survive this lethal cold. She moved deeper into the keep. She passed dining halls where feasts had rotted to dust. She passed armories where weapons had rusted to nothing. The air grew heavier, pulling her toward the heart of the fortress. She climbed the grand staircase until her legs burned. At the top stood doors forged from solid silver. A massive wolf howled at a blood-red moon on the metal surface. This was the throne room. Odette pushed the silver doors open. The room was a vast circle illuminated by the winter moon. In the center sat the throne of Ethelgard. It was a jagged throne of swords and black obsidian. Odette barely saw it. Her eyes were locked on the man, King Alaric of House Valerius. Even sitting, he was massive. He wore rusted armor and heavy furs, untouched by the passage of years. His head was bowed, eyes closed in an unnatural sleep. The power radiating from him was suffocating. He did not look like a civilized monarch. He looked like a feral god of war, chained by magic. His features were sharp and savage. Frost covered his chest. Thorny vines of black ivy anchored him to the obsidian. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. Odette forced one hesitant foot forward. Logic dictated she should find a dark corner to die in peace. But a rhythmic vibration in her ribs pulled her toward him. It was a mirror. The king's heart beat with an agonizing slowness, and her own pulse answered. Thump. Thump. She climbed the dais. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. At the summit, a thick, thorny vine snagged her boot. She pitched forward, her palm slamming against the jagged edge of the obsidian throne. The black stone bit deep. Odette recoiled with a hiss. But the debt was already paid. One bead of crimson fell from her skin. It tumbled through the frigid air toward the frozen black ivy. It struck the ice. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then came the sizzle. The sound was like water hitting a searing skillet. Where the blood touched the vine, the plant shriveled into white ash. The king's heart, dormant for a century, began to race. Odette scrambled back, pressing her wounded hand against her chest. Crack! The sound tore through the hall like a gunshot. She watched, paralyzed. The frost on the dark armor was fracturing. Pale spiderwebs raced across the ice, covering his broad chest. The dull pulse became a violent drum. Thump, thump, thump. The vibration rattled the floor and Odette's very bones. Fear flooded her. Gideon was wrong. The maesters were wrong. They believed the blood of a Packless runt would be ignored by the curse. They were wrong. It wasn't being ignored, it was the key. The black vines which had bound the monarch for 100 years began to writhe like dying vipers. They hissed and uncoiled from his limbs, retreating into the floor in a fit of primal terror. Then the ice cage exploded. A cloud of glittering diamond dust filled the air. Odette tripped over her own heavy skirts and fell hard against the stone. On the throne, the fingers of King Alaric twitched. His metal gauntlets groaned with ancient tension. Slowly, he lifted his head. Odette's breath hitched. His eyes snapped open. They were not human. They were the glowing gold of a starving predator. They burned in the shadows of his face. He took his first breath in 100 years. It was a ragged, rattling inhale. It sounded like a hurricane howling through a canyon. He sat upright. His massive frame dwarfed the throne itself. There was no disorientation. There was only fury. There was only hunger. Alaric stood. His heavy furs settled with a dull thud. He rose to his full height, casting a monstrous shadow across the hall. He rolled his shoulders, and his ancient joints popped in the silence. Then he stopped. Those golden eyes locked onto Odette, cowering at the foot of the dais. The king stepped off the throne. Each armored boot struck the stone with finality. He moved with a lethal, terrifying grace, stalking down the steps toward her. Odette scrambled backward, her skin scraping against the ice. "Please," she tried to say, but her voice had already deserted her. Death was the only logical conclusion. The nursery rhymes had promised a butcher, and as Alaric closed the distance, the myth became flesh. He stood over her, a monument of scarred muscle and ancient armor. A jagged line of white scar tissue carved a path down his jaw, vanishing into cold steel. But the starving king didn't look hungry for meat. His golden eyes were narrow, dissecting her with the cold precision of a predator grating its prize. He didn't reach for a blade. He leaned in. The air around him shifted. Odette was hit by a wall of scent, crushed pine needles, the ozone of a gathering storm, and the heavy, metallic tang of raw power. He pressed his face to the curve of her neck, taking a slow, deep breath. Odette braced for the impact of teeth against her pulse. Instead, a low vibration rippled through his chest. It wasn't a warning. It was a purr, deep, possessive, and thick with territorial claim. The sound made her blood burn. __quote _8___, he said. His voice sounded like grinding stones, rusty from centuries of silence, yet heavy with absolute command. Odette shook with a frantic, desperate energy. Alaric didn't listen. His hand, massive and rough, caught her jaw and tilted her face toward the light. His skin wasn't cold like the stone around them. It was a blistering, unnatural heat. Quote 11, he repeated. A dark, jagged smile pulled at his lips, revealing the elongated points of his teeth. Odette could only stare. Alaric's thumb moved. It traced the crescent-shaped scar on her collarbone, the mark she had been mocked for since she could walk. Quote 14, he whispered. The gold in his eyes flared into a furnace. Quote 15. He withdrew, offering a hand the size of a shield. Quote 16, he said. His voice began to swell, filling the hall with the weight of a century-old vendetta. Quote 17. Quote 18. She managed to breathe. Quote 19. He let the name linger on his tongue. His smile widened, becoming something dangerous and intoxicating. Quote 20. The sheer weight of his certainty broke the world Odette had inhabited for 20 years. She looked at the hand offered to her, strong enough to shatter bone, yet held with the reverence of a holy relic. She reached out. Her small, blood-stained fingers met his palm. The heat of him instantly scorched the winter out of her bones. As he hauled her up, the fortress screamed. A violent tremor groaned through the mountain's bedrock, vibrating up through the pillars of black marble. Then came the sound of a world breaking, the sharp, crystalline snap of ancient ice. Alaric growled. His gaze swept the thawing chamber. Odette watched, paralyzed. Around them, the thick frost on the walls began to liquefy, running down the stone like tears. Rivulets of water streamed down the tapestries, washing away a century of dust and decay. In the grand hall below, frozen monuments of failed tributes begin to fail. Without the curse to preserve them, the magic holding their tragic forms together evaporates. They crumble in a chorus of soft, heartbreaking sighs. The ice turns into fine, glittering snow that drifts across the cobblestones. The keep is finally granting them peace. But against the far wall of the throne room, the pattern breaks. 3 massive figures encased in black ice do not dissolve. They convulse. The sound of shattering glass fills the hall as the ice explodes outward. 3 lichen warriors fall to their knees. They are clad in the same dark, rusted armor as their king. They gasp for air as if they had been drowning for 100 years. Quote, 23, the largest warrior chokes out. He braces metal-clad fists on the wet stone. He has hair the color of iron and a face carved by brutal scars. This is Silas. Quote 24, quote 25, Alaric replies. His voice carries effortlessly across the vast space. Quote 26, Silas staggers to his feet. His dark eyes lock onto Odette. Immediately, he drops his gaze and slams a fist over his heart in a fierce salute. Quote 27, Odette recoils. Her shoulders hit the cold edge of the obsidian throne. Quote 28, she stammers. Her voice is frantic, bordering on hysteria. She looks at Alaric, desperate for him to see reason. Quote 29. Alaric steps into her space. His massive frame blocks out the cold light of the moon. He does not look angry. He looks fiercely, terrifyingly possessive. Alaric says softly. The gravel in his tone makes the hairs on Odette's arm stand up. If he could read the ancient texts, he would have killed you in your crib. He leans closer. A century ago, the Vane bloodline allied with the witch Agatha. They ambushed this court. They slaughtered House Crescentia, the ruling monarchs of the northern wastes. They were the only bloodline powerful enough to keep Alaric's feral nature in check. They wiped out House Crescentia, or so they thought, and then they locked the king in stone. He reaches out. His burning fingertips trace the pale, crescent-shaped scar on her collarbone. The touch sends a jolt of raw electricity down Odette's spine. A foreign, animalistic heat pools in her stomach. Alaric murmurs. His golden eyes darken to a molten amber. His scent of ozone and pine wraps around her like a heavy blanket. He explains the silence in her soul. The reason she cannot feel her wolf is because her environment was hostile. A Crescentia wolf does not submit to a lesser alpha. She goes dormant to survive. Odette has lived in a pack of traitors, surrounded by the scent of the men who murdered her ancestors. Her wolf locked herself away to keep her alive until she found him. Tears prick Odette's eyes. She remembers a lifetime of beatings. She remembers being called a null, a runt, and a worthless waste of flesh. Мучительные ночи под полной луной. Мольбы почувствовать зов крови, на которые небо отвечало лишь ледяным молчанием. Было ли это жестокой шуткой богов? Этот вопрос повис в воздухе, прошептала Одетт. Слеза скатилась по ее избитой щеке. Алларик поймал ее своим пальцем. Тебе не нужно знать как. Тебе нужно просто быть. Остальному научу я. И я сожгу этот мир дотла, чтобы вернуть тебе украденное величие». Король повернулся к своему командиру. «Сайлас, найди провизию. Забери все, что хранит эта крепость. Моя королева не пойдет на войну в обносьях, которые ей навязали Вейнс. Найди ей достойное платье». В этот час Этельгард начал пробуждаться. 3 гвардейца короля, Сайлас, Кейл и безмолвный следопыт Thorn, действовали с пугающей эффективностью. Они вскрыли древние тайники с соленым мясом, извлекли тяжелые зимние плащи из вакуумных кедровых сундуков. В потайных покоях у тронного зала Одет сбросила промерзшее платье из изъеденного молью бархата. Эту одежду ее заставила носить Сесилия. Она смыла копоть и запекшуюся кровь теплой водой. Сайлас лично согрел ее в новом очаге. В треснувшем серебре зеркала она едва узнала себя. Теперь на ней была туника из черной шерсти с густым темным мехом. Плащ скрепляла массивная серебряная застежка с гербом Валириас. Она больше не была похожа на служанку. Теперь она выглядела как воин. Синяк на щеке напоминал о жестокости, которую проявил Гидеон Вейн. Но страх в ее фиалковых глазах сменился тихим пламенем осознания. Она — кровь Хаус Кресентия. Она не раб. Когда она вышла в главный зал, Алрик ждал у камина. Он снял тяжелую броню, на нем были лишь темные кожи и льняная рубаха. Ткань натягивалась на мощных мускулах его груди. Его хищный взгляд медленно скользнул по ней, от сапог до темной косы на плече. В груди короля снова зародилось низкое вибрирующее рычание. Этот звук требовал подчинения и одновременно обещал абсолютную защиту, произнес Алрик. Он набросил на плечи тяжелый меховой плащ. «Уэйстин Мур ждет нас. Мы покажем Гидеон Вейн, кого он осмелился разбудить». Спуск из Этельгард был суровым, но атмосфера в мире изменилась. Удушающая магия, сковавшая эти земли, начала рушиться. Когда король Алрик и его гвардия двинулись вперед, мерзлая земля стала мягче под их сапогами. Окаменевшие деревья перестали издавать мучительные стоны. Их искалеченные ветви замерли в тишине. Одет ехала верхом на огромном вороном боевом коне. Сайлас вывел его из магического стазиса в нижних конюшнях. Алрик шел рядом, легко поспевая за тяжелым шагом скакуна. Он обладал невероятной выносливостью истинного хищника. Ледяной ветер и коварная тропа были ему нипочем. Однако Одет чувствовала исходящее от него напряжение. Его золотистые глаза постоянно сканировали горизонт. Ноздри раздувались, улавливая запахи на горьком ветру. Он был истощен. Столетие сна опустошило его внутренние резервы лыкан. Его зверь находился опасно близко к поверхности. Он требовал насилия и плоти. The air grew thick with the stench of the ironwood pack. Silas slowed, his voice a low rasp. They were nearing the estate. Gideon Vane's patrols were already gathered at the tree line. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. They wanted proof that the tribute was dead. Alaric's jaw tightened. The jagged scar on his face became a white line of fury. He looked at Odette. His eyes were cold enough to burn. "They are waiting to see your corpse," he said. Odette gripped the leather reins until her knuckles turned white. Images of the Ironwood estate flashed through her mind. Kaelin's mocking laughter, the weight of Gideon Vane's hand across her face. Suddenly, a strange heat ignited in her marrow. It wasn't the cold void she had carried for years. It was a pulse. A second, heavier heartbeat drummed beneath her own. Traitor. The word echoed in her skull like a snarl. She gasped, clutching her temple as a vision of bared teeth flickered. Alaric was there instantly. His hand on her thigh was a heavy, grounding anchor. He asked if she was unwell. "I felt something," Odette whispered. "It was anger, but it wasn't her own. It was something feral." Alaric's face split into a savage, knowing smile. "She is waking up," he rumbled. Your wolf smells the blood of those who broke you." He told her not to fight it. Then he turned toward the ironwood border. "Silas, guard her," he commanded. "Do not move unless she is in danger." Alaric stepped forward. Then the world seemed to warp around him. This was no modern, bone-shattering shift. It was shadow folding into shadow. His boots shredded as massive paws struck the frozen earth. Muscles surged and expanded, tearing through his linen shirt. Coarse, midnight fur burst from his skin. The man vanished. In his place stood a nightmare. Alaric was a 9-foot tower of muscle and teeth. He was the ancient apex predator the legends warned about. His eyes glowed like dying stars. A roar tore from his throat. It was a sound of absolute dominance. Every creature for miles felt the urge to kneel or die. Odette's horse bucked in terror. Silas held the beast steady. But Odette didn't feel fear. That second heartbeat was now a frantic war drum. Her vision sharpened. The world turned to liquid silver. She could smell pine needles from leagues away. She heard it then, the frantic thudding of human hearts in the distance. Alaric dropped to all fours. He became a blur of violence, racing toward the tree line. In the ironwood camp, Kalen sat by the fire. He was laughing with 5 guards. "The runt is likely an icicle by now," he sneered. He spoke of debts paid and warm beds. A younger guard asked if the magic would reject a commoner. Kalen spat into the embers. "The stone only cares for blood," he muttered. Then the sun vanished. A massive shadow swallowed the camp. Kalen never reached for his blade. A shadow darker than the night plummeted from the sky with the force of a dying star. The impact shattered the frozen earth. It hurled burning timber and broken men into the canopy. Panic reigned as the guards shifted. Their timber wolf forms looked like common curs next to the ancient monarch. This was not a skirmish. It was a harvest. Alaric moved with a lethal, fluid grace that defied his massive size. A single swipe of his claws shattered ribs. 2 wolves were thrown through pine trunks until their spines snapped like kindling. The sound of his jaws closing on a 3rd wolf echoed through the forest. A wet, sickening crack of bone against teeth. Kalen realized steel was useless and retreated. He lunged for the supply cart, his fingers closing around a heavy crossbow. He slotted a silver-tipped bolt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leveled the weapon at the black beast, but movement at the tree line froze his heart. Emerging from the shadows on a black warhorse was the girl they had cast out, Odette. She was no longer the soot-stained runt. She sat draped in royal furs, flanked by ancient armored warriors. Her violet eyes didn't just see Kalen. They pierced him with a terrifying, luminescent intensity. "You," Kalen breathed, his hands shaking. He knew he was a dead man if the beast turned. In a final act of desperation, he pivoted the crossbow. He aimed directly at Odette's chest. He pulled the trigger. "No!" Silas roared, lunging forward, but he was too far. The silver bolt hissed through the air. Time surrendered. It slowed to a glacial crawl as the projectile neared its mark. The frightened scullery maid within Odette wanted to cower. She wanted to accept the end. But something older, a dormant spirit buried under 20 years of ash, shattered its chains. "Mine." The voice in her mind was not a plea. It was a sovereign command. Odette did not shift. Instead, she thrust her hand toward the incoming bolt. A blinding flash of silver magic erupted from her palm. This was not a spell. It was the raw, kinetic dominance of the Crescentia bloodline. The silver light collided with the bolt mid-air. The thick wooden shaft didn't just break, it disintegrated into dust. The silver tip fell harmlessly to the snow. A vacuum of silence swallowed the clearing. Even Alaric paused. His muzzle dripped with the blood of the guards as he stared at his queen with feral pride. Cailan collapsed. The empty crossbow slipped from his numb fingers. He felt the aura rolling off her, a suffocating weight that demanded total submission. It was a power the Ironwood Pack had not felt in a century. Cailan whispered, his voice a broken rasp. He finally understood the horror of what Gideon Vane had done. They hadn't sacrificed a null. They had ignited a god and given Alaric his equalizer. The Lycan King stalked toward the huntsman, his massive form devouring the light. He looked back at Odette, a silent question burning in his golden eyes. His life is yours. Odette looked down at the man who had once dragged her by her hair. The mercy she once carried had been incinerated by the silver fire. "Execute him," Odette said. Her voice was eerily calm, ringing with the icy authority of a true queen. Alaric's jaws snapped shut. As Cailan's body hit the snow, the king began to shift. Alaric returned to his human form, standing naked and unbothered in the biting cold. He smeared the copper-scented blood from his jaw and crossed the distance to Odette's horse. The feral madness in his eyes did not vanish. It transformed. It became a focused, terrifying devotion. Alaric pressed his stained forehead against her knee, a king acknowledging his sovereign. "Welcome back, my queen," he murmured. "Now, we take Ironwood." The retreat from the north was no longer a flight of terror. In the year 1244, the biting frost didn't just fade, it retreated. The gale-force winds of the wasting moor seemed to bow, parting before the suffocating ancient magic radiating from King Alaric and his newly awakened Crescentia queen. Rumors of the Black Keep's sudden thaw raced ahead of them like a wildfire. They marched south, Alaric, Odette, and the three kings' guards. But they did not remain a small company for long. The oppressive rule of Gideon Vane had birthed 1,000 hidden grudges among the lesser lords. Lord William Harrington of the Riverrun Pack was the first to answer the call of the wind. He carried a debt of cold steel. His own aunt, Beatrice, had been turned to ice as a tribute decades ago. Harrington rode out with 50 elite warriors, expecting to put down a monster. Instead, he found the mangled remains of Cailan and a king of ancient myth standing beside a girl who bled pure, lunar silver light. Harrington did not fight. He dropped to his knees in the drifts, baring his throat in a total submission that his men mirrored instantly. The spark of rebellion had become a conflagration. That night, they made camp mere miles from the Ironwood borders. The air tasted of wood smoke and roasting venison, heavy with the electric hum of impending war. Odette sat on a fallen oak, watching the firelight dance. That second heartbeat inside her chest was no longer a frantic tremor. It was a rhythmic iron drum, demanding an exit. Alaric approached, his massive frame blotting out the stars. He wore a fresh tunic and a heavy leather gambeson gifted by Lord Harrington, but his movements remained those of a predator on a short leash. He sat beside her. The sheer heat of his body soaked into her marrow. Alaric said, his golden eyes tracked the fire reflecting in her violet gaze. Odette confessed, her voice a ghost of a sound. Alaric's hand, calloused and warm, found her jaw. He turned her face until she had no choice but to see him. He rumbled, his voice dropping into a possessive, low-frequency growl. He explained what Thorne had discovered in the slave camps. The lye she used to scour the cauldrons, the ash she slept in to keep warm. It was all laced with wolfsbane and ground silver leaf. Gideon knew exactly what she was. He hadn't just humiliated her. He had systematically poisoned her Crescentia blood to keep her wolf dormant under his heel. A wave of ice hit Odette, followed by a surge of white-hot, blinding fury. This wasn't a failure of nature. This was 20 years of calculated, agonizing torture. Gideon had stolen her birthright. __quote _46 __. Alaric whispered, leaning in until their foreheads touched. The scent of sharp pine and ozone filled her lungs, stilling the panicked beast in her heart. __quote _47 _. He had butchered legions and waded through the gore of usurpers. To him, fear was a dead language. He promised to be there when she finally shifted. Then it happened. The mate bond, a primal and ancient tether, locked into place. This was more than a physical pull. It was a collision of two souls recognizing their absolute equal. Odette leaned into his strength, eyes shut tight against the weight of his certainty. Silver magic danced across her skin in raw, jagged sparks. "Tomorrow," she whispered. They would reclaim her birthright. Alaric's kiss was a fleeting brush of devotion and a vow of carnage. They would not just take Ironwood, they would paint it red. Inside the great hall of Ironwood, the air was thick with the stench of forced joy and spilled wine. Gideon Vane sat upon a throne of stolen prestige, his knuckles white against his massive goblet. He laughed to drown out the way his eyes searched the frosted windows. The winter wind shrieked against the stone like a dying predator, but the Black Keep remained silent. He believed he had outsmarted a deity. He had survived the centennial tribute and cheated a god. In the center of the filth, Cecilia twirled in imported silks while her pack shivered in coarse wool. Gideon roared for his subjects to drink. He raised a toast to the Packless runt, mocking the girl whose bones he thought were warming a dead king's bed. The hall echoed with the cruel, hollow laughter of the damned. Then the world tore open. The sound was a physical blow. A hammer of atmospheric pressure crushed the breath from their lungs. The iron-bound oak doors did not just break, they disintegrated. Shards of ancient wood became lethal needles raining down on the terrified court. The laughter died in 1,000 throats. The hearth fires hissed and turned a predatory, unnatural shade of silver blue. Through the freezing mist stepped 3 titans in armor rusted by centuries of silence. Silas, Kale, and Thorne moved with a lethal, synchronized grace. Their broadswords hummed with a runic hunger the Northern Territories had not felt in 100 years. Lord Harrington followed, his river-run warriors fanning out like a closing trap. Every exit was sealed. Gideon Vane watched his wine spill like fresh blood across the cold stone floor. King Alaric Valerius did not look like a bedtime story. He looked like the god of war made flesh. His golden eyes burned with a century of caged, agonizing fury. His lichen aura was a physical weight, crushing the lungs of every traitor in the room. Strong wolves collapsed to their knees, clawing at their throats for air. The room smelled of ozone, snapping pine, and impending execution. But the king did not march for the throne. To the bewilderment of the Ironwood pack, the ancient monarch paused. He bowed his head. He stepped aside. And from the heart of the storm, Odette emerged. The hall forgot how to breathe. The ash-covered runt they had mocked was gone. In her place stood a woman draped in the heavy midnight furs of House Valerius. A tunic of woven silver thread shimmered beneath the pelts. But the clothing was secondary to her terrifying aura. A brilliant, ethereal light radiated from her skin. The Crescentia scar on her collarbone pulsed like a captured star. They had called it a curse for 20 years. Now it illuminated the grand hall. Cecilia stumbled backward, her expensive silks tangling around her legs. She screamed that it was a trick. She called Odette a null. Odette of House Crescentia finally spoke. Her voice possessed a dual timbre that vibrated in the marrow of every wolf present. It was the calm of a woman and the ancient snarl of a sovereign. "I have returned to collect my debts," she said. Gideon Vane scrambled to his feet. His face turned the color of ash. Panic overrode his logic. He reached into his cloak for a jagged amulet of dark bone. This was the stolen relic of Agatha the Witch. It was the very tool he used to suppress Odette's power. Gideon shrieked for the guards to kill the runt. 12 Ironwood warriors lunged forward with steel drawn. Alaric did not reach for his sword. The king of House Valerius let out a deafening roar. His broad shoulders expanded as his bones began to crack and shift. He was ready to paint the walls with their remains. But Odette stepped elegantly in front of him. She raised a single glowing hand. "Mine," her wolf snarled within her mind. The command demanded absolute obedience. Odette did not merely shift. She exploded into a blinding celestial light. There was no agonizing struggle or breaking of bone. In an instant, a towering white direwolf materialized. Her fur shimmered like spun moonlight. Violet eyes glowed with raw, devastating magic. She was a true ancient matriarch of the sovereign bloodlines. When her paws hit the stone, a silver shockwave blasted outward. The charging guards were thrown back like discarded dolls. Their weapons clattered uselessly against the oak tables. Odette did not stop. She cleared the distance to the dais in a single, terrifying bound. Gideon thrust the bone amulet forward, screaming a desperate incantation. The dark magic withered against a true sovereign. The silver light from Odette's jaws hit the relic. The bone superheated and dissolved into fine ash in his hand. Gideon's scream was cut short as she tackled him. She pinned the false alpha to his own wooden throne. The massive weight of her direwolf form crushed his chest. White fangs rested against his pulse. One twitch, and Gideon Vane would cease to exist. Her breath was a furnace against his skin, smelling of old blood and new vengeance. Behind her, the Ironwood pack collapsed. Lords, warriors, and servants didn't just kneel. They buried their faces in the frost-cracked stone. Within their chests, their inner wolves whined. It was the sound of 1,000 predators recognizing their superior. The true queen had taken her throne. Alaric moved through the carnage in silence. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. He stepped over the weeping Cecilia as if she were a piece of discarded refuse. His golden gaze never wavered from the massive white wolf standing over the ruins of a false kingdom. Odette stared into the eyes of her tormentor, Gideon, the man who had poisoned her soap with wolfsbane, the man who had broken plates over her head and left her to freeze in the northern wastes. A single snap of her jaws would end it. It would be easy. But death was a gift she refused to give a coward. The white wolf vanished in a flash of blinding light. Where the beast stood, a woman appeared. She landed without a sound, the royal furs of House Crescentia draping her shoulders like silver. She looked down at the man clutching his scorched hand. "You are broken, Gideon." Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I strip your name. I strip your lands. Your bloodline ends today. Your wolf is bound by the very magic you tried to steal." Gideon choked on his own breath. He felt the alpha spark, the power he used as a whip, extinguished like a candle in a storm. In one heartbeat, he became a null. "You will find your new home in the soot," Odette commanded. "The scullery is your kingdom now. You will scrub the cauldrons until your fingers bleed. Cecilia will be your shadow in the ash." Cecilia crawled toward the dais, her face wet with tears. "We are sisters, Odette. Have mercy." Odette didn't blink. __quote _53___. She turned her back on the wreckage of their lives. Lord Harrington and the warriors of Riverrun remained motionless, their blades lowered in total allegiance. Alaric climbed the dais to stand beside her. He took her hand, his rough skin grounding her magic. The Wolf King raised their joined hands. __quote _54_____. Alaric's voice shook the foundations of the keep. "The slumbering king is awake. House Crescentia has returned. Ironwood belongs to the crown." A roar erupted that shattered the remaining glass in the high windows. It was the sound of a pack finally set free. Odette squeezed his hand, the cold weight of her past dissolving. She was no longer the runt. She was no longer the servant. She was the survivor who had become the storm. Fate named her a mate. Destiny crowned her a queen. Her dominion was only beginning to breathe. In the year 1244, a winter once destined for funeral pyres transformed into a blinding dawn. Alaric and Odette did not govern through the sadistic whims of pretenders. Instead, they forged a rule of ancestral iron and lichen justice. The obsidian walls of Ethelgard stood silent and hollow. It was no longer a palace, but a tomb for a dead age. The royal court moved to the pulsing heart of Ironwood. There, the once powerful Gideon Vane and Cecilia were consumed by the shadows of the mundane. They spent their remaining years bent by the same heavy labor they once used to crush the weak. Odette had been the Packless runt, a creature thrown away to die. But she taught every soul in the Northern Territories a truth they had forgotten. Power is not extracted through a blood tithe. True sovereignty lives in the spirit of a wolf who refuses to stay buried. This ancient curse did not shatter under the blade of a ritual sacrifice. It broke because of the awakening of a true